This is Corey Franklin for obitpage.com, where we talk about people we want to remember who have died recently. And we're going to start out tonight with R. Sargent Shriver. R. Sargent Shriver died recently at the age of 95, and he was a Kennedy. But he wasn't a pure Kennedy, he was a Kennedy by marriage. He was married to Eunice Kennedy, sister of John, Ted, and Robert Kennedy, daughter of Joseph P. Kennedy. He was a dutiful liberal, and he is best known as the founding director of the Peace Corps. After he married Eunice, he was sent by his father-in-law, Joseph Kennedy, to Chicago to run the Merchandise Mart. The Merchandise Mart was part of the Kennedy Empire. So he spent his formative years in Chicago running the Merchandise Mart, and then in the late 1950s, he became the head of the Chicago Public Schools. And he was doing this job until his brother-in-law John was elected president of the United States. We did a little on that recently when Ted Sorensen died. You'll notice that a lot of the Kennedy people are dying. And after John Kennedy was elected president, he had an idea for a Peace Corps, and he selected his brother-in-law, R. Sargent Shriver, to run the Peace Corps. Here he's being interviewed by Dave Garroway. Dave Garroway was the host of the Today Show, one of the first hosts of the Today Show, well-known host of the Today Show in the 50s and 60s. They were fellow Chicagoans, and Dave Garroway asks him about the genesis of the Peace Corps.
To translate the Peace Corps idea into reality, President Kennedy chose a successful businessman who had been, up to that time, head of the Chicago Board of Education, and incidentally, a very long-time friend of mine in Chicago. Sargent Shriver. Sergeant, how are you?
I'm fine, Dave. How are you?
Good to see you. I'm fine, too. Don't see how you're so fine and healthy-looking with the job you've done. It must have been a great drain, I should think. I remember back in the early days of the Corps, people didn't believe in it, did they?
Well, I think you're right. In the early days, Dave, a lot of people thought it was a joke. Many of the experts laughed at the ideas that Americans would volunteer to serve abroad for practically no money and under difficult living conditions. At that point in the Peace Corps history, we had two jobs, I thought. First, to find out whether America could still produce tough-minded, dedicated people, and second, to find out whether foreign countries really wanted the help of Americans of that type.
Sarge, how did you find the answers to these questions, and what were they?
Well, we found the answer to the first question by calling for volunteers, and we were overwhelmed with plenty of Americans with brains and character who wanted to serve their country abroad. On the second question, we went on a trip around the world to find out whether foreign countries really wanted Americans of this type. We found out that they definitely do. These facts are no longer a matter of opinion. We've been invited to send the Peace Corps to more than 50 countries. Every country where the Peace Corps is already at work has asked us to send more Peace Corps volunteers. For example, in the Philippines, I learned that the government there is trying to improve education in the rural schools. They've got to learn English and mathematics and general science if that country is going to continue to grow and prosper. One Philippine leader explained it to me in these words. He said, "We've got the mind and the heart to do these things. Our people are ready to move. But we need your skills to help us start." Here in Ghana, the story was the same. We can build the classrooms, I was told, but we can't supply the teachers. In the Peace Corps' first year in Ghana, our 51 volunteers taught or came into direct contact with 43% of all the pupils enrolled in Ghana's secondary schools. Ghana has since asked us for 3 times as many volunteers. Teachers, of course, are only a part of the need. Here in Brazil, as in other South American countries, they wanted Peace Corps volunteers to work on farms, to help develop better methods of agriculture and rural homemaking. Our volunteers have received a warm and generous reception everywhere in South America. Country after country requested trained Americans to provide middle-level manpower: engineers, teachers, builders, mechanics, nurses, social workers, home economists, farmers, surveyors, and so on. It became apparent that they want more than manpower. Asha Devi, a famous associate of Mahatma Gandhi, expressed it this way, Dave. She said, "You think that young Americans possess the spiritual values they must have to bring the spirit of your country to our country? There's a great valuelessness spreading in the world," she said. "Your volunteers must bring us more than science or technology. They must touch the idealism of America and bring that to us."
R. Sargent Shriver was certainly an idealist. And like so many people associated with the Kennedys, he ran into conflicts with them, especially after John Kennedy's assassination. That was a touchstone for all the people who were associated with the Kennedys. One of the interesting things I found out about our Sargent Shriver is that the night that John Kennedy was assassinated, our Sargent Shriver managed to locate an engravure of what the East Room of the White House looked like when Lincoln's body lay in state after his assassination in 1865. And our Sargent Shriver was responsible for getting the details together so that Kennedy's body could lay in state with the same details in place in the East Room of the White House. After that, however, our Sargent Shriver decided to stay with the Johnson administration, which did not sit well with Robert Kennedy. There was always enmity between Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And of course, even though Robert Kennedy stayed on for a couple years as Attorney General, he didn't trust anybody who stayed with Lyndon Johnson after his brother's assassination. Lyndon Johnson started the War on Poverty as his big program, and our Sargent Shriver was made the head of a new bureaucratic organization, the Office of Economic Opportunity, and he ran that for a couple years trying to end poverty in the United States. It sort of didn't work that well, but he gave it his best while he was also working at the Peace Corps. A little later on in the Johnson administration, he was named the ambassador to France. His continued association with Lyndon Johnson, it didn't alienate him with the Kennedys, but it sort of estranged him slightly from the Kennedy family, and there was always a little bit of tension between the Robert Kennedy clan and the Shriver clan. Our Sargent Shriver always wanted an elective office. He wanted to run for governor of Illinois in 1960, and he might have won as the Democratic candidate, but his father-in-law, Joseph Kennedy, said he nixed that. He said, no, that'll just complicate John Kennedy's bid for the presidency because Illinois was such a critical state. And he was probably afraid that there would be too much of a Kennedy influence, so he didn't get to run for governor. In 1972, he was a dutiful Democrat, and George McGovern was running against Richard Nixon for the presidency, and it was a pretty hopeless campaign. Nixon had a huge lead. People didn't know about Watergate yet, and McGovern had picked Thomas Eagleton, a senator from Missouri, as his running mate. It came out that Eagleton had had electroshock therapy for depression. It looked like McGovern might dump him. At first, McGovern didn't dump him, said he was behind him 1,000%. But then public opinion forced McGovern to dump him, and he chose our Sargent Shriver as his vice presidential nominee. So he actually did run for vice president. They lost 49 out of 50 states. So he was never elected to public office. After that, he went back to his charity work. He was a good Catholic. He did a lot for Catholic charities. He worked on the Special Olympics, which his wife was involved with. In 1994, President Clinton gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. 10 years before that, his wife Eunice had gotten the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Ronald Reagan. So they remain the only husband and wife in American history who've gotten the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor conferred. His wife Eunice died several years ago. One of his children, by the way, is Maria Shriver, the NBC anchor and persona. And so that makes him the father-in-law to Arnold Schwarzenegger. So our Sargent Shriver had a very productive life. Like so many others, he had a complicated relationship with the Kennedys, which is one of the ongoing stories of the 20th century. The writer Wilfrid Sheed died recently at 80 years old, and he was one of my favorite writers. He was an English-American writer. His most famous book is a book called The House That George Built. It's about George Gershwin and American popular music. He was a brilliant writer. He came from a publishing family. He wrote about his experiences with polio as a young man. Like Sargent Shriver, he was a good Catholic, and he wrote a lot about Catholicism. He did fiction and nonfiction, including a biography of Clare Boothe Luce. And his style was different from anybody else's. It was breezy but intelligent. My favorite Wilfrid Sheed book is a book called My Life as Fan. When he was a young boy, he had polio, and he yearned to be either a cricket player or a baseball player. And that was the key to My Life as Fan. He could write equally well about baseball or about cricket. Here's a paragraph that he wrote in My Life as a Fan. So the perfect game, the one they play in heaven, may be baseball or it may be cricket, but it is without doubt a summer game wrapped in long, cold winters and plenty of reading matter. Before I'd even seen a good match, I could have done okay on a cricket trivia show. So we seem to have a pattern here, and I've often wondered what life would be like in a bat and ballless society. Would one feel an itch in the missing limb? Would one reach blindly for a twig and a pebble and start swatting? And while you're stoking the fire, how about asking yourself how Ted Williams would have made out in such a world? Or Isaac Stern in a world without violence? Take your time about answering. Spring training is still 3 months away. Wilfrid Sheed is gone now, and I, for one, will miss him. If you get a chance, pick up one of his books or anything he's written. It'll be well worth it. We're going to close tonight with Don Kirshner, the man with the golden ear. And Don Kirshner had a goal, and his goal was to take rock and roll and create a Tin Pan Alley. Tin Pan Alley was the breeding ground for the great songwriters of the 20s, 30s, and 40s in New York. And Don Kirshner wanted to do the same thing for rock and roll, and he actually accomplished it. He was responsible for gathering some of the best rock and roll writers of the late 50s and early 60s, a very underrated time in American music. It's overlooked because it was between Elvis and the Beatles. But Don Kirshner put together a stable of writers that included Carole King, Neil Sedaka, Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, Neil Diamond, Pomus and Schumann, and Boyce and Hart. I'll play you a couple of the songs that those people wrote. Suffice it to say that most of the familiar songs of the late 50s and early 60s came out of Don Kirshner's stable of writers. It was the Brill Building sound, the Brill Building being the famous breeding ground for all these writers. And actually, Kirshner and his partner Al Nevin, they created Eldon Records. They worked out of a building right near the Brill Building and then moved into the Brill Building. And their stable of writers put together all your recognizable songs because Don Kirshner could predict whether a song would be a hit probably better than anyone in history. He would listen and say, that's going to be a hit. And here are some of the songs that he listened to that were hits.
Everybody's doing a brand new dance now. Come on, baby, do the motion. Tonight, the light of love is in your eyes. But will you love me tomorrow? You won't find love me. Oh, love me. But don't forget who's taking you home and in whose arms you're gonna be. So darling, say the last dance for me. I started walking her way. She belonged to Batman Jose. And I knew, yes I knew I should leave when I heard her say, hey, now a little bit closely. I may be a fool, but till then, darling, you never see me complain. I'll do my crying in the rain. I'll do my crying in the rain. I'll do my crying in the rain.
Yeah, I always like to do a little Everly Brothers there. Maybe run them a little longer than I should, but they're the Everly Brothers and I love them. Anyway, trust me when I tell you I could go on for about 4 hours with songs that Don Kirshner made famous through his writers. But his big signature achievement was the prefab for the Monkees. And he was the music director for the Monkees. He commissioned Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart to write their theme song.
Here we come, walking down the street. We get the funniest looks from everyone we meet. Hey, we're the Monkees, and people say we monkey around.
Boyce and Hart also wrote Last Train to Clarksville for them, which was a huge #1. Neil Diamond wrote I'm a Believer for them, and Carole King wrote Pleasant Valley Sunday for them, all under the auspices of Don Kirshner. But all good things must come to an end, and the Monkees' relationship with Don Kirshner came to an end in a really funny way. Kirshner had all this great Brill Building talent a little after their heyday. You know, the Beatles had come in writing their own songs. The Monkees grew tired of being under Don Kirshner's thumb. He was sort of an autocratic guy, especially Mike Nesmith. Mike Nesmith fancied himself a rock and roll writer, and the Monkees, you know, wanted to be more like the Byrds. They wanted to be more avant-garde. Don Kirshner wanted to make money. So things were coming to a head. One day, Mike Nesmith put Don Kirshner up against a wall. Apparently, Don Kirshner said, I'm going to bring you guys a song, and this song is so good you're going to sell 5 million copies. And the Monkees were tired of having him bring them songs. You know, Mike Nesmith wanted to write his own stuff, and that's where they almost got in a fight. But Don Kirshner persisted. He said, no, you don't understand. This song is going to sell 5 million copies. You know how much money that's going to be? And the Monkees said, stuff it, we're not going to do this song, and in fact, we're not going to do anything more with you, which, Don Kirshner couldn't understand. So that was pretty much the breakup of Don Kirshner and the Monkees. Well, Don Kirshner still had this song, so what he did was he took a studio group of musicians, guys who never played together, and he created a group, and they recorded that song. And he was wrong. The song didn't sell 5 million copies. The song sold 7 million copies, and after that, Don Kirshner's attitude was no more rock groups, sort of like Zero in the Producers. Next time, no author, no more rock groups. I'm going to close with the song, but before I play it for you, I just want to know in the 1970s he became a rock impresario and had Don Kirshner's rock concert, which was on late at night and was a sort of a staple for college kids. And then he sort of retired to his home and his pool and his kids and his family. But he had the golden ear, and for about 15 years there, from about 1960 to 1975, Don Kirshner could pick a hit better than anybody in pop music. Oh, that song we were talking about, well, that sold 7 million copies. It became the #1 song of the year 1969, and you've got to wonder whether the Monkees ever had second thoughts in their later years. But Don Kirshner remained true to his word, no more rock. He decided to call those session musicians that he put into the studio the Archies, and here's the song.
Sugar, oh honey, honey, you are my candy girl, and you got me wanting you, honey. Oh, sugar, sugar.